The rooftop was cold, not weather cold, kept cold by protocol cold. I was standing exactly 30 paces behind Warlord Vile, calibrating the dreadnought's orbital defense grid on my diagnostic tablet. The atmospheric scrubbers on the upper hull were functioning perfectly, cycling recycled oxygen through the massive vents with a steady, monotonous hum. The freezing temperature did not come from the environmental controls. It came from her. It radiated outward from the dark, interlocking, carbon-weave plates of her Zelkari armor, a physical manifestation of absolute authority and absolute isolation. 13 months. She had not removed a single piece of that armor in 13 months. Not for mandatory medical scans, not for sleep, not during the long, lightless transit between the core worlds and the frontier. Watch the biometric sensors in my medical adjutant uniform, which I had calibrated 3 times that morning because the initial reading seemed completely illogical for a biological organism, registered her core temperature as dangerously low. I am a pragmatic physician. I have published 6 internal reports detailing how Zelkari commanding officers do not require standard psychological decompression. I am currently rewriting all 6 in my head. 600 days had passed since anyone had spoken her actual name. To the Fleet Command, she was the Warlord. To the Galactic Senate, she was a tactical asset. To the enemies of the sector, she was an extinction event waiting to be deployed. Names require a degree of familiarity. Familiarity implies a lowering of defenses. For a sovereign who had traded every soft instinct for a sharp edge, and a vulnerability was a fatal tactical error. So the name Vael remained buried, unspoken and rotting in the silence of the upper atmosphere deck. She commanded the space simply by existing within it. Her posture was an iron rod. She stood by the reinforced viewport, staring out at the shifting nebulae, completely motionless. Sometimes, if the harsh, artificial hangar lights hit the microscopic gaps in her heavy plating at the correct angle, you could see the faint glow of her bioluminescent vein lines. They were sluggish, fading, a biological system quietly suffocating under the weight of self-imposed exile. I watched her rigid silhouette against the stars and recorded her vitals in the official ship log as optimal. My first professional failing of the day. In the far corner of the observation deck, a piece of forgotten furniture sat bolted to the deck plating, an empty metal chair. It was dust-covered and meaningless. It belonged to an era when this dreadnought had carried diplomats instead of planetary siege weapons. Now it was just a shadow in the periphery, serving absolutely no purpose other than to highlight the vast, empty space around the commander. She was an island of jagged metal. Nobody crossed the water. If you love quiet stories where small acts of kindness break through impossible walls, subscribe to the channel. We explore the softer side of the galaxy every single day. The heavy blast doors hissed open. Protocol strictly dictated that only high command personnel were cleared for the rooftop observation deck during a navigation cycle. The individual who walked through the doors was not high command. He was wearing a grease-stained gray jumpsuit, carrying a canvas tool bag that clinked with unauthorized metallic modifications, and he was whistling on the command deck. He was an electrician. He belonged to the Human Auxiliary Pool, classification HJ3. His name tag read Marcus in faded peeling letters, and he had a thick smear of thermal paste across his left cheek. Nobody noticed him. The 2 royal guards stationed at the perimeter didn't even shift their ceremonial spears. Human maintenance workers possessed a unique, bureaucratic form of invisibility. They were the background machinery of the ship. They fixed the lights, they cleared the vents, and they existed fundamentally beneath the notice of the military elite. He walked right past a Tier 1 plasma cannon without glancing at it, and where he stopped at a blown relay box mounted on the bulkhead, exactly 10 feet from the Warlord. A loud metallic clang echoed across the deck. He had dropped his tool bag. The heavy metal hit the deck plating with zero grace. The royal guards twitched, their hands tightening on their weapons. The warlord did not move a single muscle. Marcus just sighed, dug around in his battered bag, and pulled out a wrench that looked like it had survived atmospheric re-entry. Always the upper relays, he grumbled to himself, completely oblivious to the lethal tension in the room. Here the official record requires a biological clarification. He didn't know that Zelkari bioluminescent vein lines only pulse faster when their emotional shielding collapses, causing their armor plates to physically tighten around their vital organs. It is an involuntary defense mechanism, a physiological brace against sudden trauma. He did not know this because human electricians do not study xenobiology. An electrician had no business being in the same room as a warlord. He certainly had no business seeing her vein lines. But there he was. Marcus approached the damaged relay panel. It was mounted unusually high on the bulkhead, just above the warlord's peripheral line of sight. He reached up with his wrench, realized he was too short by a fraction of an inch, and lowered his arm. He looked around the cavernous, heavily militarized deck. His eyes landed on the forgotten chair in the corner. He walked over to it. He didn't submit a requisition form. He didn't ask the royal guards for permission to alter the deck layout. He simply grabbed the heavy metal chair by its backrest and pulled it out of the shadows. The metal legs scraped against the deck plating, a horrific, grinding noise. My medical readout spiked with a sudden surge of adrenaline. He carried it right next to the warlord. He set it down less than an arm's length away from her armored shoulder. He didn't step on it immediately. He paused. Cold upper atmosphere air was rushing out of a cracked vent directly above them, blowing down over her rigid form. He shivered, his shoulders bunching up inside his thin gray jumpsuit. "That can't be comfortable," he muttered. He wasn't talking about the broken vent. He was looking directly at her heavy locking plates. The armor that had fused shut over 13 grueling months. He turned his attention back to his work. He reached up to rip a frayed wire from the panel, holding the heavy metal chair with his left hand to stabilize himself. The wire snapped with a sudden hiss of sparks. His right hand dropped. His fingers were warm against her vein lines. She flinched, not from pain but from vulnerability. 13 months since anyone had touched. The empty chair was still in his other hand. "Good morning, Vielle." 11 minutes. Her plates tightened for 11 minutes. The sound started deep within the interlocking carbon weave of her suit. A microscopic shifting of gears, pressure seals, and magnetic locks. It was the sound of a fortress aggressively reinforcing its own walls. Her body was reacting long before her mind could process the intrusion of a single soft greeting. The Zelkari biological defense mechanism activated violently, sealing her in, and locking down every conceivable physical vulnerability. But it was too late. She froze in place. Her breathing stopped entirely. The bioluminescence beneath her collarbone, visible through the tiny gap where his fingers had accidentally grazed her, flared from a dull, dying gray to a blinding, piercing blue. The light bled out into the freezing air of the observation deck, which meant the biometrics were failing. They did not. I need to start that sentence over. The biometrics were completely accurate. She was experiencing a catastrophic emotional collapse. I steadied my diagnostic tablet. I forced myself to log the environmental temperature of the room. The numbers were perfectly stable. The calm I had manufactured for myself collapsed. I was watching the supreme commander of the sector military unravel because a maintenance worker had used her first name. She did not speak. She could not. The overwhelming pride that had held her spine perfectly rigid for 600 days shattered silently in the cold air. The armor was crushing her, tightening with brutal mechanical force, responding to the vulnerability she was strictly forbidden to feel. She was a sovereign who had systematically forgotten how to be a living creature, suddenly reminded of her own skin by a man who made 20 credits an hour. The reverberation of those 3 words pushed outward like a kinetic pressure wave. The two royal guards stationed by the primary blast doors stopped breathing. Their ceremonial spears dipped toward the floor, losing their perfect vertical alignment for the first time in their careers. They stared at the electrician's back, waiting for the execution order to echo across the deck. It never came. I looked down at my medical scanner. The data streams were completely erratic, scrolling too fast to read. I noticed a thick smear of industrial lubricant on the corner of my tablet screen. I rubbed at it with my thumb. I focused on that grease for longer than was professionally appropriate. The space between the warlord and the human hummed. It wasn't just the ambient noise of the dreadnought's machinery anymore. The air felt physically heavier. And the chair, the dust-covered piece of forgotten furniture that had spent years rotting in the shadows. It was no longer meaningless. It was sitting there, exactly where he had placed it, for bridging the impossible physical distance between a god of war and a man with a wrench. The silence stretched across the deck, completely unbroken, thick with the weight of an impossible shift. If you want to see how this quiet moment changes the dreadnought forever, join us for part 2. Sometimes the smallest act carries the heaviest weight, 0 words spoken. The silence that fell over the observation deck was not the mere absence of noise. It possessed immediate, crushing physical mass. It felt like standing directly beneath the exhaust thrusters of a heavy cruiser a fraction of a second before main ignition. It was dense, suffocating, and entirely centered on the massive armored form of Warlord Vale. Marcus turned back to the blown relay panel, and he did not seem to notice that he had just triggered a catastrophic biological lockdown in a sovereign commander. He pulled a pair of wire strippers from his heavy canvas bag. The scrape of the cheap metal against the polished bulkheads was excruciatingly loud. He clamped the tool around a thick red cable and squeezed, completely absorbed in his menial task. Behind him, the warlord was drowning in her own defense mechanisms. The interlocking carbon weave plates covering her chest cavity were emitting a high-pitched, almost subsonic thermal whine. I watched the biometric telemetry on my diagnostic tablet with a rising, icy sense of professional terror. The Zelkari physiology is a marvel of evolutionary hostility, designed to survive orbital kinetic impacts that would pulverize a lesser species. But this was not a kinetic impact. And this was a cascading emotional collapse. Her armor was autonomously sealing its microfractures, tightening its magnetic locks, and physically compressing her rib cage to protect her vital organs from a threat that did not exist. She was using a siege survival mechanism to survive a greeting. I checked the environmental sensors again, desperate for a mechanical failure to explain the data stream. There was none. If this telemetry data reaches the Admiralty before my transfer paperwork is fully processed, I will undoubtedly be reassigned to the Human Studies Division, and I have 3 young offspring waiting for me in the core worlds. I do not want to study humans. They are a chaotic, illogical variable that completely defies clinical categorization. The numbers on the screen stabilized. They were terrifyingly high, still. And the 2 royal guards had ceased their microscopic peripheral scanning patterns. They were completely rigid, their 4 ocular sensors dilated to maximum capacity in the dim, cold lighting of the deck. They were waiting for the warlord to execute the human. They were waiting for the deck to be cleared of biological waste. They were waiting for an order that was currently trapped behind 13 months of fused carbon weave and suppressed instinct. Marcus spat a piece of plastic wire casing onto the floor. He hummed a tuneless, arrhythmic melody that barely carried over the steady drone of the atmospheric scrubbers. The contrast was genuinely nauseating. Here was an apex predator, a commander who had ordered the orbital glassing of entire continents, currently paralyzed by the warm imprint of 5 human fingers, while the human in question was primarily annoyed by a frayed copper connection. Even the silence knew this was a permanent breach. He finished the splice with agonizing slowness. Every wrap of the black friction tape was a deliberate, measured movement, that seemed entirely disconnected from the lethal tension suffocating the rest of the observation deck. He smoothed the edges of the tape down with a heavily calloused thumb, his breathing completely even. He let out a long, satisfied breath, the kind of breath a laborer takes when a minor annoyance has been successfully eradicated. The Warlord's bioluminescence was still blindingly bright beneath her high collar. The piercing blue light bled through the microscopic gaps in her tightened armor, casting long, jagged, erratic shadows across the polished deck plating. It was a distress beacon screaming into the void. Marcus looked at his wrist chronometer. It was a bulky, outdated analog device with a cracked glass face. He tapped it once with his grease-stained finger, seemingly confirming a time schedule that only he cared about. Then he reached deep into the side pocket of his jumpsuit. He pulled out a foil-wrapped ration bar. It was not standard military issue. It lacked the sterile, uniform geometric shape of fleet nutrients. It was lumpy, slightly squashed, and looked vaguely like something that had been baked in the chaotic, completely unauthorized ovens of the lower deck auxiliary mess hall. It smelled faintly of synthetic cinnamon and burnt sugar. He looked at the sealed relay panel. He looked down the long, empty expanse of the observation deck. He looked at the Warlord, who was standing beside him like a monument to violence carved out of black ice. Then he sat down. He sat on the metal chair, the forgotten piece of furniture he had dragged out of the shadows. The object that was supposed to be a ghost, a relic of a softer era before the war had hardened them all. He dropped his entire body weight onto it with a heavy, unapologetic sigh. He stretched his legs out, his heavy steel-toed boots resting casually on the pristine observation deck. I was about to override the local comms and recommend immediate standard quarantine procedures to the guards when a red warning light flared intensely on my medical console. I ignored it. I was gripping the reinforced edges of the tablet so hard my own circulatory fluid was pooling painfully in my fingertips. Marcus began to unwrap the foil. The crinkle of the cheap metallic packaging was impossibly sharp. It cut through the heavy, vibrating silence like a surgical laser. He peeled the wrapper back, exposing a crumbly, pale brown substance. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, methodically, his jaw working in a relaxed rhythm that completely ignored the terrifying gravitational pull of the Warlord's proximity. He swallowed. He brushed a crumb off his thigh. He didn't look up at her. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, staring out the massive viewport at the slow, cold drift of the nebulae. The atmospheric scrubbers hummed. The Warlord's armor continued its agonizing, high-pitched thermal whine. She had stopped correcting herself. The rigid discipline was failing. He spoke to the glass. His voice was completely devoid of reverence, fear, or military protocol. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the casual weight of a man explaining why he had brought a jacket. I just didn't want you eating alone. The 11 minutes were up. The sound that followed was not an explosion, though my internal auditory receptors physically braced for one. It was worse. It was the sound of a fundamental structural compromise. A deep, pneumatic hiss echoed outward from the massive joints of the Warlord's shoulders. The interlocking carbon weave plates, which had been fused shut against the vacuum of space and the vacuum of absolute command for 13 agonizing months, finally disengaged. Click, hiss, release. Her rigid, impossibly straight posture broke. It was just a fraction of a movement, a single millimeter of a slump in shoulders that had carried the tactical weight of a sector fleet. But in the hyper-disciplined physiology of a Zelkari commander, a millimeter was a tectonic collapse. The glowing blue vein lines along her neck shifted dramatically. The frantic, piercing emergency flare color cycled down, cooling rapidly into a soft, slow-pulsing violet. It was the absolute biological marker of vulnerability. The color of a Zelkari stepping out of a fortified bunker and leaving the heavy blast doors unlocked behind them. She turned her head. The mechanical servos in her thick neck armor whined in sharp protest, fighting against a year of accumulated frost, microscopic dust, and deliberate disuse. The movement was incredibly slow. It was the movement of someone testing a limb that had been broken and reset a very long time ago. She looked down. She looked at the human electrician sitting on the piece of salvaged furniture. I noted with a profound sense of psychological detachment that the crumpled foil wrapper resting on his knee caught the harsh overhead lighting, reflecting a tiny distorted, prismatic rainbow onto the dark deck plating. It is deeply unsettling how the mind fixates on shiny, completely irrelevant garbage when the higher cognitive functions are systematically overloading. Galactic law had no precedent for an electrician dismantling a warlord. They'd need to write one. She did not reach out to take the food. She did not issue a verbal command to execute him for his insolence. She just stood there, her heavy armor venting built-up internal heat in a soft white mist that drifted slowly across the deck and curled around the worn toes of the electrician's boots. The terrifying apex predator of the frontier, a being whose mere presence usually commanded total silence and absolute obedience, had been entirely neutralized by a squash pastry in a chair. It was already done. The silence had fundamentally changed its texture. It was no longer the silence of a held breath. It was the silence of a long, shuddering exhalation. But that moment of total surrender was still 600 hours away. Right now, it was just the prologue, the very first microscopic crack in the ice. The next navigational cycle, the upper relay panel, did not require maintenance. The internal diagnostics were entirely green. The current flow was optimal. There was no mechanical reason for a human auxiliary worker to be on the command deck. Marcus arrived anyway. He walked onto the observation deck at the exact same hour. He carried his heavy canvas tool bag, the metallic clinking announcing his arrival long before the heavy blast doors fully parted. He walked right past the two royal guards, who had suddenly developed a deep, unwavering, and intensely professional interest in the architectural molding of the ceiling. He walked to the far corner. The warlord was already there. She was waiting. Her armor was not locked. The heavy magnetic seals around her collar were completely disengaged, pulled back to reveal the soft, pulsing violet of her vein lines against the dark, textured skin of her throat. It was a staggering display of biological trust. She did not turn to look at him when he approached. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead on the slow, cold drift of the stars outside the viewport. But the space between them was no longer a tactical exclusion zone. It was no longer a radius of fear. It was just a shared quiet, a small, impossible pocket of warmth in a freezing room. The metal chair was there. It had not been removed by the maintenance crews. It had not been pushed back into the shadows. It sat exactly where Marcus had placed it the cycle before. Actually, that was mathematically inaccurate. My spatial scanners running quietly in the background indicated that the chair had been moved. Not by the human. It had been rotated precisely 15 degrees inward, closer to the warlord's standing position. An unspoken, imperceptible invitation, negotiated in the dead of the night cycle when no one was watching. He dropped his tool bag. The sound echoed softly, because he didn't care about rank. Every morning, he sat down. He pulled a new foil wrapper from his pocket. The brutal, suffocating isolation of Supreme Command had been breached. Not by a fleet action, not by a siege engine, but by a man who simply didn't know how to leave people alone in the dark. It wasn't a choice anymore. The biometric telemetry, which I had calibrated 3 times that morning because the initial readings seemed like a catastrophic hardware failure rather than a genuine biological response, indicated that her core temperature was slowly rising to match the ambient warmth of the man sitting beside her, which is not a sentence I ever expected to formulate. The chair wasn't empty anymore. Neither was she.